Sir, it is now more than 6 weeks since the finance bill was presented to the House along with the budget for 1964-65. Government's policies as reflected in these proposals have been very fully discussed in both houses of parliament. In my reply to the journal debate, I had explained the broad economic and social objectives of the tax proposals. Elucidations of the detailed implications of these proposals have also been furnished to honorable members. I would therefore draw attention to the document rationale of the tax proposals circulated a few days ago, which relates to the basic economic objectives with the specific tax measures in this finance bill. It is not therefore necessary for me now to go again into the economic basis of the budget. The tax proposals have evoked a considerable amount of active and well-informed interest and perhaps also active resistance among certain sections not only in this house but also outside, in the press and among the public at large. Some of the interests concerned have made specific representations to government. This wide discussion that has taken place has been very useful and has helped us to formulate certain amendments to streamline in proposals in the finance bill to give a measure of relief where it was deserving and to remove some unintended hardships and anomalies. The official amendments that have been tabled are as a result of this process. I placed them before the House in the hope that the provisions of the finance bill as modified by these amendments will serve to implement more effectively the basic objectives of the budget, namely growth with social justice, and I shall confine my remarks in the main to explaining how the amendments proposed fit into the overall rationale of the provisions in the finance bill. Sir, at the time of introducing the budget, I gave some thought whether it was necessary for me to introduce the finance bill as it related to direct taxes at the same time, and whether I should not follow the practice followed in the United Kingdom of introducing a bill later on after outlining the provisions. Finally, I stuck to the convention, but in the light of my experience this year, I do hope to be able to make the departure, namely the announce the proposals first and bring in the bill later. The structure of personal taxation in the finance bill is considerably simplified. 1. The main changes introduced in this year's budget aim at simplification of the rate structure of income tax, relieving persons in the lower and small income groups from the burden of compulsory deposits, moderating and readjusting the incidence of tax consistently with the interest of revenue, and introducing the advantage of tax savings in mobilizing greater private savings in the middle and higher income groups. Overlapping surcharges on income tax and super tax have been abolished and replaced by a single surcharge for purposes of the Union. This surcharge operates in respect of unearned income only when such income exceeds rupees 10,000 and in regard to earned income when such income is over rupees 1 lakh. In carrying out these changes in the structure of personal taxation, a somewhat higher incidence of tax might have arisen at some income levels when compared with the incidence of net tax for 1963-64, exclusive of the element of compulsory deposit. This has been criticized in the House and outside, and I have been considering whether some concession could be given to lower income groups in the income range up to rupees 20,000. The effect of these changes on married individuals with more than one child, which is the most important category of assessees, will be to lower the tax payable on earned as well as unearned income as compared to 1963-64 rates, including the compulsory deposit at all levels of income up to rupees 8,500. On incomes above this level, there will be a reduction expect at a few points where the tax payable now will be slightly higher, but in no case exceeding 1/5 or 1% of the total income, and these concessions will provide a measure of further relief to these income groups. The annuity deposit scheme in the new scheme of taxation is an important instrument of mobilizing private savings and to counter inflationary trends. The provisions relating to this scheme have already been fully explained and I need not go into them again. I would therefore confine myself to the changes that are proposed to be made. I had already indicated in my reply to the journal discussion in the Lok Sabha that the deposit is proposed to be made optional in the case of persons who are more than 70 years of age. Such persons under the amendment may exercise the option not to make the deposit in the first year of assessment. In the extraordinary situation created in the wake of the partition, it became necessary to enact a law to deal with the properties left by the evacuees. In the first instance, various state governments enacted their own laws. The central law on evacuee property was enacted in 1950. With the gradual return on the conditions of normalcy, it became possible to relax the provisions of this law. In 1950, the provisions relating to intending evacuees were done away with and the procedure for confirmation of sales under Section 40 simplified. A year later, in May 1954, the next step towards further relaxation was taken and the necessary amending legislation was passed in October 1954. The amending law provided that no person could be declared as evacuee for any action of his after the abrogation of the law. It also provided that no notices could be issued after the expiry of 6 months from the date of its enactment, that is, after the 7th April 1955. In May 1955, we found that nearly 2 lakh cases were pending under the Evacuee Property Act and the Allied Act relating to the separation of evacuee and non-evacuee interests in composite properties. The size of the problem was thus fairly large. So long as large number of cases remained pending, thousands of persons who were involved as parties in these cases would remain in a state of uncertainty. We thought that it was our foremost duty to ensure the expeditious disposal of these cases. We therefore studied the working of the Act to look for any relief which could be afforded to the members of the minority community within the 4 corners of the Act. We found that about 9,000 Muslims had applied for the restoration of their properties under Section 16. It was urged that the officers of the Custodians Department tended to insist on very rigid proof of continuous stay in India in the form of ration cards. Instructions were therefore given not to insist on ration cards and to accept other collateral evidence as proof of residence in India. Even oral testimony of respectable witnesses living in the neighborhood could be accepted. For the disposal of the pending applications, 3 special officers have been appointed in the ministry. Another matter of which came to our notice related to persons who had occupied vacant evacuee properties without permission, taking advantage of the abnormal circumstances prevailing after the partition. It seemed unfair to us that after all these years, large-scale dislocation of these persons, many of whom were Muslims, should be caused by asking them to leave the houses. We therefore decided that occupation by those persons who had occupied the premises on or before the 31st December 1950 may be regularized, provided that the arrears of rent were paid. To help those who were unable to pay the arrears of rent, the facility of payment in 12 installments was given. In regard to the large number of judicial proceedings pending in the Custodians Department, I wrote personally to every custodian expressing my deep anxiety in the matter and the need for speedy disposal. I also pointed out to them the desirability of taking a broad view of evacuee property cases and not to be guided by narrow or legislative considerations. As a result of the persistent efforts in this direction, the number of cases has been brought down to less than half.